Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri, USPIE's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sheri delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. I'm your host, Sheri, and I have a great show for you. Joining me today is Liberty Sentinel Media CEO Alex Newman. Alex speaks regularly on topics ranging from education and economics to climate and international affairs, and he has shared the stage with the likes of President Trump, Ron DeSantis, General Mike Flynn, Charlie Kirk, Kirk Cameron, Phyllis Schlafly, Glenn Beck, Ben Carson, and countless other American heroes. Before I bring Alex on, do me a favor. Give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the show. And be sure to visit USPIE.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. USPIE's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit USPIE.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. My guest today is Alex Newman, an award-winning international journalist, educator, and author committed to faith, family, and freedom. Alex is the president of Liberty Sentinel Media and a nationally syndicated radio host, with his work featured in the Epoch Times, the New American, and on major networks like Fox, Newsmax, and CNN. Alex has written several books, including Crimes of the Educators, and most recently, the best-selling Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. His investigative journalism and expert analysis on education, geopolitics, and liberty have made him a sought-after speaker worldwide. Above all, Alex is a devoted husband and father of 6, splitting his time between the U.S. and Europe while continuing his mission to inform and inspire. Alex is also a close friend to USPIE. He appeared in our film, Truth and Lies in American Education, and he's on our advisory board. Alex Newman, welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Sheri.
Oh, I'm the one who's honored. You have been a gentle mentor to me over the years. And so it's really a blessing that we have continued in this relationship. And I've learned so much for you and truly am honored to have you on this show. So before we get...
the feeling is mutual. Thank you, Sheri.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Alex. So before we get started, I want to play a short clip from our documentary film, Truth and Lies in American Education, where you interact with my daughter-in-law, April, and you talk about how education is the primary battle that undergirds all other battles. Let's watch.
So excited all day to meet you.
Oh, well, wonderful. I've been excited too, so it's very nice to meet you. And do you ever notice that the establishment, if you will, seems so cocky? They seem so sure of themselves. There's no question in their minds that they're going to succeed. And I would argue that the reason they're so confident, the reason they're so cocky, is because they have 87% of our kids in the public school system, and they are being indoctrinated to accept this anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-God future. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to lose it all. This is the battle that is going to affect all the other battles. So, we're all involved in different things, protecting gun rights, lower taxes, saving babies from abortion, all these things. And they're all very worthy battles. They all need to be fought. But the thread that runs through all of them is education. Because if we lose on the education front, we're going to lose on every front.
I love that last line, Alex, that if we lose on education, we lose on every other front. With President Trump promising to dismantle the Federal Department of Education, what are some of the battlegrounds our movement should still be focused on?
Well, thank you, Sheri. This is the most important battle by far. All the others are secondary because all of them hinge on this education question. If they brainwash 80% of the kids, we might hold back the tyrants, the totalitarians, the God haters for another generation if we're really good at politics. But over the long run, they've got it in the bag. So we've got to focus on this. And I would say the battle over the U.S. Department of Education is still not over. Yes, Donald Trump is working to shut it down, but there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do that, as you know, Sheri, and as USPIE has been pointing out for many, many years. I'm very concerned about some of the efforts that we're reading about, some of the ones that we're seeing about. For example, Senator Mike Round's bill that would really redistribute a lot of the worst functions of the U.S. Department of Education over to other agencies. So you'd move some of it to Treasury, some of it to Health and Human Services, some of it to Interior, some of it to State. That's not really what we're hoping for, right? What we want to do is to get the federal government completely out of education, all the mandates, all the programs. It's unconstitutional. It's unwise. And as a step in the right direction, that could be a precursor to further eroding government control of education and ultimately putting that back in the hands of parents. Right? You hear a lot of people talk about shutting down the U.S. Department of Education as if it were the only objective. I would say it's a step in the right direction. And so what this is going to take, the really critical battle here, is actually a shift in public understanding. We now, for so many generations, almost 5 full generations, have grown up where the status quo is the government educates children. I think that was a catastrophic mistake. I think we need to rethink that as a society. We need to look honestly at the results of that. And there's really encouraging data, Sheri. Just last week, I put out an article about the latest polling on this. Gallup found that 73% of Americans are dissatisfied with the government school system. You wonder what's wrong with the 24% who are satisfied with it. They probably work for the system or they live under a rock, but this is progress. So what we need to do now, I think, as a society is recognize that this was a foolish experiment to begin with. We need to go back to what worked for centuries in America, even before we were a country, before the government took over this really critical institution of society, the upbringing, the education, the discipling of children. And that's going to take a paradigm shift in how we think about things. So I think that's really the next big frontier. We got to focus on shutting down the Department of Education. It's critical, but that is a step in the right direction, not the end goal in and of itself.
Oh, that was really powerful. And I agree, of course. And you know that our mission here at USPIE is to close the Department of Education, and beyond that, to end all federal intrusion in education, because we know that there's several other agencies that also influence education in the states. There's Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture. You know, they all are funneling grants into the states with certain criteria that they have to meet so that they can push their agenda. And that's why it's our mission, because we've understood as an organization that that's where the majority of the nefarious pedagogies originate, and it's incentivized with federal dollars, a very small amount of money really in states' education budgets. So these are the kinds of things we're trying to bring to light to the public, that we're dependent on the federal government. They control 100% of our classrooms, and yet states only receive on average about 10% of their education budget from the federal government. So we agree with you, of course, wholeheartedly that it is a step in the right direction. And we also agree that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. So yes, shifting the functions into other agencies does not end the federal intrusion into states' education. And, we have a blueprint that we've developed, and we're getting this blueprint out to as many decision makers as possible. We sent one to all the cast members in our film, so I hope you received that. But our blueprint
Absolutely.
I believe it's a solid plan. And even though we do mention a couple of things that could be transferred to other agencies, we think appropriately. For example, the Office of Civil Rights should be moved into the Justice Department. So there are some functions that don't necessarily need to disappear, but are more appropriate in another agency. But the majority of the functions need to be just pulled out by the root. And so our plan describes how you can do that. So we also agree with you, Alex, so much about this being fundamental to all other issues. We understand, and we are sounding the alarm to people across the country that if we don't stop the indoctrination of children in this country, we will lose what little freedom we have left. So I appreciate, again, your mentoring over the years, because several years ago, you and I had a discussion, for example, on school choice, and I was just adamant that it was the solution. And you were very, very gentle with me as you explained your position, and it gave me pause. And I learned so much from that, as so many other things that you have helped me to understand. So, in our film, Truth and Lies in American Education, you say that probably the most serious flaw in our education system is that it attempts to exclude God, and that the fruit of that is the eventual collapse of our civilization, with skyrocketing rates of depression, suicide, violence, drug abuse, abortion, and everything else. Do you see a role for state and local government in education?
Well, I think right now, if we just look at the situation objectively and realistically, the role for the state and the local government in education is not going away. I think over the long term, that is a very desirable goal. But having government involvement in education at all, first of all, from my perspective, from the Christian perspective, from the biblical perspective, is highly inappropriate. The Bible never assigns responsibility over education to government. I mean, the Bible is so clear on this. It defines very clearly the purpose of government. It is to punish evil. It's to be a terror unto evil. Murderers, rapists, thieves, etc. They should be the targets of government, not families and children. Right? That is a realm that is clearly assigned to parents. Now, even if you don't approach this from the Christian perspective, and I recognize there's a lot of people in America who are not Christian. It's a free country. You can believe whatever you want. And our founders intended that. They didn't want the government dictating orthodoxy. They didn't want the government telling people what they had to believe. Most of them were Christians, and they hoped that their posterity would be Christian, but they didn't see a role for the federal government dictating religion. And many of them were even opposed to that at the state level. And when you have a society where you don't have a government church, which I think is ideal, we've seen the problems that have come from government churches, that opens up a big question about education. If the state or even the local government is going to play a role in education, what worldview are they going to teach? What view of humanity, the purpose of life, the transcendent is going to be taught? And there's no answer that will satisfy everybody who's paying taxes into the system and everybody whose children are being subjected to this system. So I think ultimately the goal should be a free market. And even if you take the whole religious component out of it, we all recognize, I think all sensible people recognize, that it would be a catastrophic mistake to have the government run our grocery stores. We all recognize that it would be a catastrophic mistake to have the government run our farms. We saw what that looked like in the Soviet Union. We can see what that looks like right now in Cuba. It's a terrible, terrible system. Cuba ran out of sugar. How do you run out of sugar? Right? One of the biggest, strongest exporters of sugar historically now has run out of sugar. How does that happen? Only socialism, communism, central planning can bring about such a ludicrous result. So even just from a common sense perspective, we want high quality and reasonable cost. Free market is the answer. And that's true across almost every sphere, maybe with the exception of policing, national security, things like that. But almost every industry, almost every sector of society would be better served by a free market. And that is absolutely true when it comes to education. And that's what we had in America before the government took over education. So over the long run, I would like to see state and local government out of education for the same reason that I, even setting aside again the biblical argument, the other arguments, for the same reason that I don't like collective farming in the Soviet Union. I don't think government-run schools are a good idea. They produce so many problems. Even the best of intentions, you'll end up with low quality and high price, which is exactly what we have now. Less than 1/3 of the kids in the government schools can read or write at a proficient level, can do math at a proficient level. They all know all about the gender stuff, the climate stuff. They don't know what bathroom to go into, but they don't know any of the stuff that people expect them to know. So a return to a free market system with a big role for the church and a primary role for the parents, I think, is the ideal. Again, I recognize that's not going to happen tomorrow or next week or even next year, but I think it's important to have in mind what is the ultimate objective and then move as rapidly as we can in that direction. So we can start by getting the feds out. Next up, we can start by getting the state out. Then, it's back at the local community level. That would certainly be a big improvement. And then once we're all dealing with this at the local level, different communities can try different things. And I think over the long run, people would say, well, do we really need Christians to pay taxes to educate people in a school where they're teaching different doctrines? So I think over the long run, that should be the goal, Sheri, but I recognize that that's a long way out.
Well, I think that's very wise. And I've interviewed some other guests on this show who share your sentiment. And really, I think 10 years ago, and you know this to be true too, Alex, people would have thought we were off our rocker if we suggested such a thing. And I remember thinking our mutual friend, E. Ray Moore, was a little kooky when he thought that Christian families should take their kids from the government schools. 20 years ago, it was just unimaginable that would even be discussed. But today, it is being discussed, seriously discussed by many people around the country. And so I think that's what encourages me so much, is that we are on a path toward that end, and it will take time. I agree. And so the thing I like to tell people is, and by the way, I love that you call them government schools. That is the vernacular I also use, and I correct some of my colleagues and encourage them to use the same terminology, because that helps people really understand that these schools are run by the government, and why in the world we ever thought it was a good idea for the government to educate our children, I can't understand. So it was a flawed idea from the beginning, and we're seeing the fruit of it now. So we need to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like us to talk about what's happening politically as it pertains to education policy and advocacy. I'll be right back with my interview with Alex Newman right after this. Government-enabled school choice is becoming all the rage. U.S. Parents Involved in Education's mission is to empower parents. That is why USPIE opposes government-funded school choice and advocates for parental choice, free from government regulation. When government money follows the child, regulation follows the money, and regulation forces all school alternatives to comply with government mandates. In this Trojan horse-like model, the only choice is which government-regulated school children will attend, which is no choice at all. True parental choice can be enabled only by an unrestricted tax credit earned by simply checking a box that reads, "My child does not attend public school." As of today, federal child tax credits already carry no rules or regulations, and parents can use these funds as they see fit. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, and connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I am your host, Sheri Few. I'm here with Alex Newman, and we're discussing the education policy under a second Trump administration. Are you seeing a different approach from Trump 47 than you saw from Trump 45? Do you see, for example, any signs of how he's thinking about the Department of Education based on who he nominated to lead it? Former Secretary Betsy DeVos and her current pick, Linda McMahon, come from very different backgrounds, and perhaps were picked for different reasons by a different Trump. What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Sheri. I think Trump learned a lot in his first term. And this is not just true on the education front. It's true across the board. There's several different policy areas that I follow very, very closely. And he is doing far better this time around than last time around in terms of understanding what he wants, understanding how to make it happen. And so I'm very encouraged by that. There are some red flags for me when it comes to the education area in particular. And not just in terms of the personnel, but also in terms of the policy. So let's start with the personnel. Linda seems like a very nice lady. I don't know her personally, and my understanding is that she was brought in to really help unwind this thing. We've got to shut it down. So she's not there to be a permanent feature of the bureaucracy. And I think that's a good thing, right? That's the kind of person we want, is somebody who can wind this thing down, not somebody who can empower it or use it for different purposes. There is somebody below her, the Deputy Secretary of Education nominee, who I'm very concerned about, Penny Schwinn. And I made some of my concerns about this known privately through back channels. And so did many of us, by the way. It wasn't just me. And so I know there are people in the Trump administration who understand these concerns. As far as I know, as of right now, when we're recording this, her nomination has not been pulled yet. So don't know quite what to make of that. But I will say her background is very, very troubling. I first came across her, and she's been in education policy world for a long time, but I first came across her a few years ago in Tennessee. She was the commissar of education there, and she made a proposal. Her name was on it. She had a nice quote in the press release where she proposed very seriously that the government ought to be visiting every single child in the state at home try to separate the child from his or her parents and interview the children and ask them about their vaccination, their stress level, their education, their parents, their food, their mental health. This is highly, highly inappropriate. And by the way, these weren't only the victims of government schools. This was for homeschoolers. This was for private school children as well. That's the same kind of idea that we heard from the Nazis. That's the same kind of idea that we heard from Chairman Mao, from Joseph Stalin, right? The idea, and when you read her quote, she talks about all the stakeholders need to rally around this idea so we can protect our children. I'm sorry, Ms. Schwinn, and maybe you're a really nice lady. Again, I don't know her, but that's not your job. They are not your children. They're not children of stakeholders. They're God's children, and he entrusted them to parents. And unless there's evidence of some sort of crime being committed, you have no business showing up at anybody's house asking to talk to the children. That's absolutely outrageous. So that idea was withdrawn after not just a statewide outcry, but a national outcry. But this lady just reinvented herself and went back to doing the same thing. And there are many, many other things that are troubling in her background, her time in Texas, her time in California, weird issues with contracts and conflicts of interest. And you look at the handful of conservatives or alleged conservatives who are still publicly supporting her nomination. And the one thing they point to is, well, she supports school choice. Okay, well, let's have a discussion about that. I looked at, what has she said about school choice? And her own comments prove the worst fears of all the critics. They prove exactly what I've been saying all along. I found a quote she offered, I think it was to the Fordham Institute, if I'm not mistaken, and it's been widely reprinted. She said something like, well, we can't just give out money. We have to have high standards and accountability and transparency. In other words, we're going to give money, but then we're going to take over. We're going to tell them what they ought to be teaching, how they ought to be teaching, how they ought to be measuring. We're talking here about making the private schools and the home schools into extensions of the government school. It's the worst possible idea, and it's exactly what me and so many others have been warning about when it comes to this school choice issue. So I think Penny Schwinn is a very, very bad pick, and I hope that either she will be withdrawn, her nomination will be withdrawn, or the Senate will block her confirmation. Unfortunately, there's a lot of rhinos that love her. Jeb Bush, of course, is one of the big cheerleaders. He's a Republican. So, when Jeb Bush is supporting your idea, you probably need to reconsider your idea. Just throwing that out there. Now, on the policy front, I think Trump is hoping to use some of this power that's been usurped by the federal government over a period of many generations for good purposes. And I do believe that Trump is genuine. I do believe he believes what he says. I do believe he wants what he says he wants. He wants to make our country great again. He wants to stop the brainwashing of our children. He wants to stop the transformation of our children into little Marxist revolutionaries. And he's spoken out on this many, many times. And I'm beyond grateful for him shining the light on this. He's exactly right. When he says the reason our cities were burning is because our kids are being brainwashed in the schools, he's 100% right. And of course, the temptation is always going to be there. Well, there's this sword. We should wield it for our purposes, right? So we should now tell the schools in California that they better stop doing this. I understand the temptation, and I'm almost inclined to say, hey, that power exists. The Democrats usurped it. Why don't we turn the tables and do this? But I just want to throw out a word of caution here. We need to be destroying this usurpation of power, not using it for our own purposes, because if it survives into the next administration, we don't know who's going to be the next president. It might be another deep state Democrat puppet. What are they going to do if this power survives into the next administration? Well, they're going to do exactly what Joe Biden did. They're going to do exactly what Barack Obama did. They're going to use these tools to force this absurdity back on schools in South Carolina and Oklahoma and Idaho and Florida, and we certainly don't want that. So I would throw out that word of caution. And I would also say on this idea of school choice, which unfortunately has become a rallying cry for a lot of people in the Trump orbit, I would throw out another caution. I've seen where this goes. I was living in Sweden when the school choice trap closed. It was a disaster. All private schools that were taking government money, which was basically all private schools, were required to teach the government's national curriculum. It was an atrocity. The same thing will happen here over the long term. The same thing already is happening here over the long term. So I understand Trump's desire and the desire of so many great Americans to find a way to get these children out of the public schools as quickly as possible. I'm 100% with you on that. We must do that. We've got to find a way to get these kids out. And I don't know many people who've spoken out on this more strongly, more vociferously than I have. So nobody can accuse me of being an apologist for the public school system. Okay, one of my missions in life is to rescue children from this system. But the risk is that if we do it this way, where the government money starts going directly to the private schools or to the homeschool families, the regulations, the control will follow. That's why Bill Gates has such a big interest in promoting this school choice idea. That's why UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, put out a report calling on governments to hand tax money to what they call non-state education providers. They said it very clearly. It's so that we can impose our equity requirements, our testing regime, the data gathering, our curriculum, our standards on all options. And so when you're talking about putting at risk the fundamental freedoms, the fundamental rights that our people have fought for so many decades, to get this temporary benefit, I think we really need to hit pause here and have a discussion about the risks here, because the risks are enormous. And as we've seen in the states that have pursued this, the benefit is actually very, very small. Arizona was the first state to do a universal school of choice. A very small number of people have left the government indoctrination camps as a result of that, but very large percentage of the homeschool community has now surrendered, and the private schools, by the way, have surrendered a large degree of autonomy. And the current Democrat governor has been very open. One of her first things when she took office was put out a press release saying, hey, I'm in charge now. We can't just give out $1 billion to all these private schools and homeschools without accountability. They need the same high standards that we have in the public schools. So this might be the biggest own goal in the history of the education freedom movement, and we've got to tap the brakes and think about this.
Amen. Very well said. And you know, of course, that I agree with you. And I alluded to earlier the fact that you mentored me on that issue, because for years I thought it was the correct solution. And so I have learned over time, and our organization has opined on this. And we believe that there are lots of things to be concerned about, many of which you mentioned. But another point that can be made is that what's happening in these states where they've enacted school choice or voucher programs is the states are now funding two systems. It's not as though the Democrats accuse us of, draining money from the public or government school system. That's not what's happening at all. So the governments in the states are now setting up a separate system that's being funded by the taxpayers in addition to the existing failed system. So what really needs to happen is, as the enrollment in government schools declines, so must the budgets. We must cut the budgets. Students need to be funded by enrollment. And we have to recognize, we need to let taxpayers know that this is not the solution for all the reasons you mentioned, which are probably even more important than that. But sometimes money really talks to people. And if they understand that that's what's happening with this voucher program, hopefully they will be better prepared to say, no, this isn't a good idea for our country. So let me just respond to what you said about Trump's executive orders and his initiatives thus far. We also agree with you as an organization that executive orders can just be changed by the next Democrat president that comes along. So we need permanent, long-term solutions for getting government out of education. And he wants to close the U.S. Department of Education. And again, we have a plan for how that can be done. And we're really hopeful that some of the blueprints we mailed out all across the country, I think we mailed out 800 copies a week ago. We're really hoping that some influential people in his circle will get wind of that and take on the advice that we're providing as far as how this can be done, where it will be a permanent fix to having the federal government out and not just a temporary solution. So that's very important. And just one other thing I'd like to respond about that you said, I was really intrigued that you mentioned that no one else is a stakeholder in children's education, and they are not our children. So anytime I'm editing work, that's one word I always remove, because a lot of people use that term, our children. Well, no, they're not our children. That's the left's perspective, is that they belong to the community. What was it that Hillary Clinton said? It takes a village to raise a child. No, that's not true. It takes two loving parents to raise a child. And so our organization did not support and still does not support parental rights legislation, because we believe and understand that our rights come from God. And once we have the government dictating what our rights are, they can also tell us what they are not, and take them from us. But one of the words that they use, and it's really come from this legislation, is the idea that parents are the primary stakeholder. And so I did hear you use the word primary, which obviously they are primary, but I agree with you. There are no other stakeholders in the raising of children. And so I think a lot of people, uh, well-intentioned conservatives, get hung up on this parental rights legislation and this idea that somehow there are other stakeholders in their children's education. So thank you for articulating that so well. So I noticed, Alex, that our new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, endorsed your latest book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Do you know him personally, and do you see yourself playing some kind of a role in shaping education policy under an administration that has recruited young leaders, many of whom are non-establishment people who, like you, have challenged the status quo?
Well, thank you, Sheri. And yeah, I was very honored to have Pete Hegseth endorse the book. In fact, I worked with him on a docuseries he did for Fox. It was actually their most viewed series ever. It was called The Miseducation of America. Phenomenal series. I would encourage people who haven't seen it yet to watch it if they can. Exposing a lot of what happened with how government took over education and what has happened since then. It was incredibly significant. It got into John Dewey and Horace Mann, the anti-Christian ideology that was always part of this movement to have the government take over the education of children. So I think Pete Hegseth understands this better than almost anybody in the country from his time at Fox. He's, of course, written books on this subject as well. And it's he and I both agree this is one of the most important topics that anybody could be focusing on. So I'm glad to see him at the Department of Defense. Fixing our military is an existential need. If we don't get that in order, the education discussion might even become a moot point as well, because if the Chi-Coms and the Russians and who knows who else take down our country, we won't be talking about education. We'll be talking about assembling firearms and resisting. So we've got to deal with that as well. And I think Pete is the right man for the job. I have been working with a lot of people in the administration on the education front and other policy areas behind the scenes. I don't intend to move to Washington, D.C. It would take a lot to get me to leave my home. But to the extent that I can be of service to anybody in any of these areas, another area that I've focused a lot on is climate policy, international affairs, the United Nations. So I am at their disposal whenever they call on me. I'm always happy to assist. And I'm really excited by so much of what we're seeing, Sheri. It's in many respects, it's better than a lot of Trump supporters even realize, because the fake media hasn't caught up to it all yet. They still haven't realized everything he's doing. It's just such a whirlwind. So as awareness spreads about what some of what he's doing, more liberal heads are going to explode. And so we need to be praying for our liberal friends that they would see that these things are really actually a good idea for all of us, for our country. They're very necessary. I do hope that on the education policy front, we end up moving in the right direction. We can't expect all of our hopes and dreams to be realized in a 4-year period. It took over 100 years to get us into this mess. It's going to take us a very long time to get out of it. But you know, we're on the Titanic, and the Titanic has already hit the iceberg. And Donald Trump and his team are frantically trying to deal with this before the ship goes down. It's going to take a lot. It is by no means guaranteed that we're going to be successful here, but I can't think of a better team to do this than the team that Trump has assembled. And it's going to require help from, I think, all of us. We all have to educate ourselves on these things. We all have to lean on our members of Congress. Like you said, Sheri, executive orders can be reversed by the next president. There's a lot of rhinos in Congress right now, Republicans in name only, who will do everything possible to make sure that we don't get these changes enshrined into federal law, to make sure that the next deep state puppet who ends up in the White House can reverse it all with a stroke of a pen. So this is really something that's all Americans need to be involved in. It is, I think, a life and death struggle for the future of our country, really even the future of our civilization, the future of our rights and liberties. And I do hope that everybody will be involved in some way, even if it's just getting to know your elected officials, leaning on them when the time comes, when it's appropriate to get good things done. And so I'll leave it there, Sheri.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So let's take a quick break. Don't go away. I'll be right back with Alex Newman right after this. U.S. Parents Involved in Education advocates for parental sovereignty, but unlike many who support government-sponsored school choice, USPIE believes that parents who take money from government programs like education savings accounts and other voucher schemes are in fact surrendering their educational freedom because all government programs are regulated. According to the Cato Institute, regulations only tend to increase with expanded use over time. In most states, private and home schools have very limited regulation, giving maximum freedom to parents to choose educational options free from harmful content. We at USPIE are glad to see momentum growing in the education freedom movement, but the current money follow the child approach is flawed and must be reconsidered. Go to uspie.org to find the details of our proposal for enabling parental choice free from government intrusion. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I am your host, Sheri Few. I'm here with Alex Newman, and we're discussing the question of school choice. So what are your thoughts on this, Alex?
As I said before, I think the vast majority of the people who are pushing this are very well-intentioned. They have the same ultimate objective as me, which is to get as many children out of this failing, disastrous system as quickly as possible. So we share that objective in common for the most part. I think there are snakes who are among us who are pretending like they share that view, but who actually have an ulterior motive, and we can talk about them in a moment. But, I just want to make clear from the start that I know a lot of really great people who are pushing this idea. I respect them. I love them. I know they're well-intentioned. I know they're acting from good motives. So, with that caveat out of the way, I'll say right away, I think this is a very, very dangerous idea. If you look at the legislation that has already been passed in these Republican states, it already puts the camel's nose under the tent when it comes to homeschooling and private schools. So this is not something that might foreseeably happen in the future. This is something that already is happening. As soon as you take the money, you lose your autonomy. As soon as you take the money, in many states, now you're required to take the government tests. And we all know that what is tested becomes what is taught. No homeschool family wants to look silly when they take the government test and it shows that their kid doesn't know as much as the victims of the brainwash camps. So they're going to modify what they're teaching. And that should really, really alarm everybody. Now, there's encouraging news on this front. The exodus from government schools is accelerating. It's massive. In fact, the Learning Council, an organization, just put out a forecast not too long ago where they said that by 2030, 50% of American students will be out of the government schools. Only half of the students will be in traditional government schools. So that's really encouraging. But then on the flip side, and they say this very clearly in their report on this, the line between public education and private education is going to become increasingly blurry. And that's my major concern right there. At this point, there's almost a consensus in America that the government schools are a disaster. Again, I mentioned that Gallup survey that shows 74% of Americans are dissatisfied with the state of government education, with the quality of government education. So there's more consensus on that than just about anything, right? Out of 31 areas that the pollsters at Gallup asked about, education was 29th in terms of how upset people are. Right. Americans are furious. They're deeply dissatisfied with this. So we're seeing an exodus. It's excellent news. But this idea of blurring the lines, there are powerful people who want to see that. They want to control private schools. They want to control homeschooling and ultimately suck us all into the same failed system that is failing to teach children how to read, that is failing to teach them how to write, that is failing to teach them math, that is failing to teach them right from wrong, that is producing confusion, suicide, depression, mental illness. And so we should be looking at the government school and saying, wow, how do we get as far from that as possible? Not, how do we extend this to the people who are successful, the homeschoolers and the private schools? So the legislation that we're seeing really concerns me. And it's unfortunate, Sheri. I know a lot of the legislators who are promoting this. They're friends, people that I've known for years, really great Americans. And there's part of it that is fear. You've got huge money now backing this. Bill Gates, the billionaire, of course, is one of the major sources of funding for this school choice movement, and there are others. Betsy DeVos, I've got a video of her talking about how we need to see all education as public education because it's of benefit to the public. No, right? It goes back to the idea of the children, right? They're not the government's children. They're not the public's children. They're God's children, and God has entrusted them to parents who are solely and completely responsible for their education, their upbringing, their well-being, their health, their mental health, and all the rest of it. So there is a lot to be encouraged by, but if these forecasts are correct, that we are going to continue seeing an exodus, but we're going to see private schools and homeschools become more like the government schools, that's not really a victory in the true sense of the term. It may end up being a disaster like what we saw in Sweden. So we've got to stay very active on this front. We can't let our guard down, even though in many cases now we're opposing our friends on these issues. It has to be done, not out of malice, but out of concern for our rights to educate our own children. And this is a critical battle that we have to engage in.
Yes, I agree so much. And so I have a similar experience with legislators that I know in my state. On the state level, even our Freedom Caucus group, which, is small in numbers, but they're growing, but they are 100% behind school choice. And I even met with them and explained what a threat it was to the homeschool community and to the good private and Christian schools that we have. So, and I've recently learned what you just disclosed about Bill Gates being behind this. And I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder they're being so effective. He's pouring probably billions of dollars into this. And my experience in the Common Core battles told me that he was the one funding all of that as well. So he definitely has an agenda. It's a nefarious agenda, and he's using his billions of dollars to influence these policies. So people need to know that anytime you see Bill Gates funding involved with something, it is not to the benefit of our country. And it is an intentional agenda to tear down what we have, which we've already been losing, but he wants to go ahead and put the last nail in the coffin and have us become a different form of government. So I really appreciate your depth of knowledge on that subject. And I'm really encouraged, Alex, to know that you are working behind the scenes with the Trump administration. You don't know how much hope that gives me, because we have been trying to, get someone's ear, just someone to look at the blueprint. So I'll be sharing with my board and our leadership team this disclosure about you working behind the scenes, because that gives us all quite a bit of hope. So thank you for sharing that. So this has been a great conversation, but our time has quickly ran out. And I feel like we need to have you on the show on a regular basis. But before I let you go, I'd like to ask you 2 questions that I ask of all my guests. First, what are some of your concerns regarding education in America? And of course, you've covered a lot of that already. So if that's redundant, don't worry. But then what are some of the things you're optimistic about?
So my concerns regarding education is that we are going to pass a certain point where the decline will be irreversible. We will have dumbed down and mentally and spiritually and morally and academically destroyed such a huge percentage of our population that it will be impossible to turn that around. And we may have already passed that. I don't know. I like to be an optimist, but if you just look at the government's own numbers, it's terrifying. I recognize that God is sovereign and he can get us out of any mess if he chooses to. But when you look at what has happened, even just in the last generation, it is so alarming. Who would have believed 10 or 15 years ago, even, if we were told that there would be children dressing up as animals and meowing in class and demanding to have litter boxes in the bathroom? Who would have believed that children starting as young as kindergarten would be encouraged to think that they were born in the wrong body, and that castration of little boys would be seen as a reasonable solution by this system to the alleged problem of being born in the wrong body? Nobody would have believed it, right? And so it's kind of like the frog in the boiling water. It just gets more and more crazy to the point where now we're just like numb to it. Oh, litter boxes in schools. Oh, okay. Oh, double mastectomies for little girls who are confused. Oh, okay, that's not good. And then we forget about everything that was going crazy before that. So I hope we haven't passed that point yet. It's a scary thought. It's a very scary thought. And so that's one of the reasons why I think this is so urgent. On the encouraging front, for the first time in my lifetime, certainly, we do have a president who's committed to reversing that. We do have people in authority at the state and local level in big parts of the country who are absolutely committed to stopping and reversing that. My own state of Florida is a good example in some ways of that. We're seeing an awakening among Americans where almost all of us recognize the government schools are a joke. There was another poll put out just a few months ago. Over 60% of Americans think you see the media as enemies of the people. And that's not a term I like. It reminds me of Fidel Castro or something, these guys might say. But it's true. The fake media, it's not just a difference of opinion. It's not just biased or whatever. It's not even just fake news. It's psychological terrorism, a psychological warfare being used against Americans. And it seems now we have critical mass understanding that, at least among adults who still have some of their reasoning faculties. So I'm encouraged by some of the awakening that we're seeing. I'm encouraged by a lot of the information, the disclosures that are being made right now by DOJ and others. I'm encouraged that we've got good prosecutors at DOJ, good U.S. attorneys now going after some of this. I'm encouraged that we're going to see some big changes in the military and the FBI. And I'm encouraged that more and more parents and more pastors are recognizing the seriousness of the education issue. This was really taboo in churches for really generations. And a lot of people say, oh, it was the Johnson Amendment. It even goes back before that. When the government first started arguing that it needed the children in government schools, like in Massachusetts, they literally had to bring out the militia to force parents to hand over their children. And then we kind of just went to sleep and that became the norm. But now we're starting to see this resistance again. We've got great legal minds arguing that the government school system is unconstitutional on its face. So there is a lot to be encouraged by. And one of the things that I'm really, really excited about is how churches seem to be shaking off the fear, shaking off the ignorance, and getting more active in the culture. Pastors now more and more are starting to speak out. They're starting to encourage their congregations. They're starting to preach the whole counsel of God, as the Apostle Paul put it, rather than just bits and pieces or 52 different sermons on John 3:16 each year, mostly taken out of context. We need the churches to be at the forefront of this movement. We need the pastors and the parents. So I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing on that front. And yeah, those are some of the things that I'm tracking, Sheri, that are both alarming and encouraging.
Well, you summed that up very well. And, I'm encouraged to hear you say that churches are more acceptive of speaking out on the education front. I'm actually reading, and I'm a little late to the party on this. This book came out 2 years ago. I'm sure you've read Eric Metaxas' book, The Letter to the American Church. And I'm so moved by what he's saying. And of course, I'm going to buy a copy for my pastor, and I pray that we see more of what you're talking about, because what he talks about in his book is that the German church during World War II negated their responsibility, and he sees a parallel to what's happening in our country, and believes that if the church doesn't step in and step up, then we're going to see similar travesties in our own country. So thank you so much, Alex. This has been a very enlightening conversation. And again, I hope that we'll have you back on a fairly regular basis. I know you're a very busy man, but you are always exposing new and important topics. So we'd love to have you again. And we just thank you for everything you're doing to inform people and elevate the conversation about not only education, but so many other topics you regularly engage in all of your platforms. So what's the best way for people to find your content online, Alex?
Well, thank you, Sheri. The kind of the landing page, libertysentinel.org, is my company website. People can find us there. We got a free newsletter. I'm also senior editor at The New American. People can find us at thenewamerican.com. I'm on X at AlexNewman_JOU, senior fellow at Classical Conversations, the largest actually homeschool program in the country, 125,000 students. I've got my own kids enrolled there. Executive director of Public School Exit. So folks who want help figuring out how to get their kids out, pastors who want help figuring out what to do on this. So you can find us there, all kinds of free resources. We'll do whatever we can to help. And those are all good places to start. There's a whole lot more, Sheri, but I can leave it there. So.
Well, that's amazing. I don't know how one person is able to do all that you do and help to raise 6 children. You are an amazing man, Alex Newman. I believe God has blessed us with your commitment to everything that you're involved with, and I pray that He continues to bless the work that you do. So thank you, Alex. We really appreciate you. Thank you for listening and supporting our work. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.